All right, history students at Lewis Clark State College, Professor Eric Martin, and let's set up the rest of the documents for Chapter 16 so that you've got some better ideas about what to look for. Now, all the documents that you're looking at for the rest of Chapter 16 are primary sources. So, first off, every document has a short introduction. Don't ignore it. The questions that get asked in those short introductions are intended to guide you. So read them. Once again, don't forget about the questions on the inside cover of your book. Those are excellent questions for any primary source document. If you've got some notes on these things, you'll be able to talk about them. Who produced the document? When and where? Who was the intended audience for the document? It's not us. What are the main points of the document? And what does this document reveal about the time and place in which it was written? If you can answer those questions, you can contribute to an interesting discussion in class about these documents. For these particular documents, I want you to think about one more thing. These particular documents we're going to use as our way of getting into issues of the Atlantic slave trade. The first documents in this particular chapter looked at interactions between Europeans and Native Americans, really particularly looking at the Spanish, and that element of the creation of the Atlantic world. The other element of the creation of the Atlantic world that we really need to spend some time looking at is the interaction between Europeans and Africans. And these documents do that for us. So, a few things to think about as we go through each of these documents. The nature of the institution of slavery. And I like to divvy things up into kind of basic social science categories. And you can play with this question for each of these documents. Do the authors of the documents describe the institution of slavery primarily as an economic institution, as a political institution, or as a social and cultural institution? Now, of course, they're not necessarily going to come in neat boxes. You might run across documents where it's all one. And you might come across documents where, well, they talk about it as an economic institution in this way, but in this other way, they talk about the politics of it. And in this other way, it's clearly social and cultural. That's fine. It's kind of mark it. That gives you stuff to talk about in class. Mark that in your notes. So let's talk about the documents at the individual level, some things for you to take a look at. The fourth document, Nzinga Imimbe, that is it's an official diplomatic correspondence, right? It is a letter from one king to another king, the king of Congo to the king of Portugal. And it has the kind of language that you would expect to find in some kind of a diplomatic correspondence. What does the king of Congo want? And what is his take on slavery? Again, cultural, social, political, economic. What do the Portuguese have to do with any of this? That's a good spot to start. Document 5, Captain Thomas Phillips. He's the captain running a slave ship. The title of the document, Buying Slaves in 1693, probably gives you a clue as to the way he sees slavery primarily. But does that mean you can't figure out some things about the politics? Does that mean you can't figure out some things about the cultural and social aspects of it? One of the things that he describes is the whole process of purchasing a cargo. What is the process? How long does it take? What do you pay with? How are prices negotiated? That can give you some clues into these other elements. So take a look at that. He's really looking at the process about things. Document number 6, and I'm going to butcher this last name, J.B. Romaine, is a really interesting document. Romaine is a 12-year-old boy who has been put on this ship by a family member for transport to the Caribbean to another family member. And so he's essentially, a temporary ward of the ship's captain. And this document is a diary entries to his mother. So on the one hand, we get a look at using diaries as historical sources. And on the other hand, we get some ideas about from a 12-year-old in 1819, keeping in mind that a 12-year-old in 1819 is going to have very different experiences than a 12-year-old in 2021. But we get these documents from a 12-year-old in 1819 looking at this whole purchasing of slaves, transporting slaves. What is his journey like? All right, what is his journey like? And that should give you some ideas, in terms of whether he's thinking about it as economic, whether he's thinking about it as culture and social or political. And then finally, we have this piece by Venture Smith. And Venture Smith piece is part of a body of work of slave narratives. So there's a number of slaves who eventually kind of write their autobiographies, their life stories, and Venture Smith is one of them. And he spends most of his life, maybe all of his life, in New England and in Rhode Island. And so his portrayal of slavery might look quite different than maybe what you were expecting to see in sort of Southern plantation type slavery. So, what is his experience like? And then again, economic, political, social, cultural. How does the institution of slavery operate in each of those realms? And I think that if you can approach the readings asking these questions, get yourself a half a page of notes or more on each of these, you ought to have plenty of material for your formal essays. You ought to be set in case there's any kinds of reading quizzes, and you ought to be able to participate in our class discussions at a high level and get some good class participation points. That's all I got. See you around campus.